While you and I might have been gripped by the dreary economic outlook, the collapse in business confidence and consumer confidence, the micro, the macro picture, local startups have been keeping investment going. And there is a good story to tell, a real good story to tell in the startup sector. Silvertree Internet Holdings says it has seen a 330% per annum growth for 2015, bringing in $10 million, that's American dollars, in revenue. This is the MoneyMakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight I'm speaking to MoneyMaker extraordinaire Paul Cook, the founder and managing director of Silvertree Internet Holdings and Silvertree Capital, about their plans to invest that $10 million into African economies, despite lots and lots of headwind. Paul Cook, nice to have you with us. What made 2015 so good?
Great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I think 2015 was a fantastic year. I think 2016 we're hoping is going to be even better, and projections so far are that it is. I think what we're really building on is the fact that absolutely Africa is developing, absolutely Africa is going to follow more developed parts of the world in the importance of the internet in the economy. And we're really capitalizing on that, and we think we've been able to build an investment model which allows us to engage in early stage internet startups in Africa and really invest in those businesses, and take advantage of this long-term trend that we're in the middle of.
Give me a case study or two from 2015. What were the big winners?
Well, good. So a couple of examples. I mean, on the e-commerce side, we've invested in cyberseller.com as well as faithfultonature.co.za, both of which are e-commerce businesses providing, in one case, wine, and in Faithful to Nature's case, natural and organic products. And I think what we're capitalizing on there is South Africans becoming increasingly demanding for convenience and for range that you can get online, as well as great value. These are still small parts of the economy, but online retail is obviously growing, and we're capitalizing on that. On the other side, for example, we bought pricecheck.co.za as well as Pricecheck in Nigeria from Naspers, and there I think really benefited from our in-depth understanding of what's happening on the ground and our ability to really operate assets as well as invest in them. And we're excited about Pricecheck going from strength to strength. So it's a combination of investing in early stage businesses as well as bringing new expertise to existing businesses.
Let's talk about South Africa for a moment, then we'll talk about other geographies too, because I want to get on to what's happening in Kenya and what's happening in Nigeria in particular. But let's look at South Africa. Is your focus purely on Stellenbosch? You just have to drive up the road from our Cape Town studios, past a couple of wine farms, if you can, into the centre of Stellenbosch and put up a little spaza shop and say money available to startups, and you'll have 10,000 people queuing at your door.
Absolutely, that's the case, and we get pitches every day. Unfortunately, many of them we're not able to invest in, partially because we just don't have the capacity to engage with everybody who's looking to raise money, but also because the South African startup community is still very early stage, and we definitely don't have the depth of experience and expertise that Silicon Valley does. And so we are naturally quite selective in the businesses that we invest in. But nonetheless, I think there are some very exciting businesses coming out of especially the Western Cape, and we're privileged to be able to work with some of them, and many more that we're not able to work with. But absolutely, this is the Stellenbosch and Cape Town are the epicenter of the South African startup environment.
But Joburg's supposed to have a sort of a Silicon Joburg of its own, isn't it? Or is it not really coming to fruition in your experience?
I think what we do see is as in Silicon Valley, I mean, Silicon Valley developed in San Francisco, not in New York. And I think we have a somewhat similar pattern here, where Johannesburg is home to the corporates, whereas people in the Western Cape maybe have to be a bit more creative about creating their own opportunities. And so Johannesburg is definitely playing catch up, but also some good businesses coming out of Johannesburg too.
We're seeing the emergence then of some highly skilled, highly talented, highly qualified tech entrepreneurs, and they're going into a space possibly where they're not getting into large-scale manufacturing, they're not getting into large-scale employment. This is solving their needs as entrepreneurs, but is it solving a country need, a continental need, in terms of what we so desperately have to have, and that's jobs?
Well, right. So that's an excellent question. And I mean, across our investments, we now have slightly north of 200 jobs across the businesses we've invested in, most of those in South Africa. And indeed, there are quite a few of those which are fairly high skilled and for which we really struggle to find the talent, especially in software development, high-end digital marketing, etc. But there are also many of those which are, packing and delivering orders out of warehouses or manning call centers. So it absolutely creates jobs across the spectrum. I think very definitely a case of, with real focus on high-end talent, we're able to create businesses which then create jobs across across the spectrum. And you're right, it's not manufacturing. On the plus side, it requires a lot less capital than manufacturing does. And so we're able to create jobs with very little upfront investment required.
Is there a tipping point in terms of these sort of tech startups where one happens and suddenly it needs a service, so another starts up to service the first business, and suddenly you get this ecosystem? I hate the word, but you guys like to use that kind of word. You get this ecosystem actually almost naturally evolving, and it almost becomes viral in its extent.
Well, absolutely, and I guess there's two sides to it. So the one that you highlight is the need for service providers, and indeed some of our more successful investments have been in, for example, digital marketing, where we're providing services to other online businesses as they expand their reach. So there's absolutely a network effect in that point of view. But there's also a broader ecosystem effect, where the more successes you have, the more there is knowledge in the industry of how do you start a startup, how do you present that startup in a way that's attractive to investors. You also educate investors that this is actually an interesting asset class. And certainly in South Africa, investing in early stage startups as we do, it's certainly not a crowded environment at all. And there are very few people doing what we do. But certainly the more successes you have, the more this ecosystem will grow and create more opportunities. And that's really what Silicon Valley has done so successfully, is build the ecosystem. And I think the last piece of the ecosystem is around professional services. So we've worked with accountants, we've worked with lawyers, obviously. And in all of those cases, it's been an interesting journey for those professional services firms to understand a different way of doing business, a much more quick-moving and dynamic way of doing business compared to their experience of traditional corporate South African approach.
I was talking to
absolutely network effects to benefit from.
I was chatting to the Dutch-based head of Uber for the Middle East and Africa, and she was saying that so many of the professional services providers simply don't understand the businesses that are being created nowadays. Certainly a lot of people struggle to understand Uber. I guess you come across that a lot, where somebody started, I don't know, a cyber seller, for example, and people who are used to going into a wine shop and looking at the labels and getting one-on-one service find it hard to believe that people are happy to click on a case and have it delivered to their home.
There's a lot of education of service providers, of investors, of customers. We are seeing it getting a lot easier. So in the early days of e-commerce, you would get a lot of customers phoning in and asking where your shop was. That happens much less these days. But nonetheless, there are still real barriers of understanding and of appreciation for what we do. I mean, another good example is even the process of clearing money through the exchange control system. So we bring in mostly foreign money in order to invest in South African businesses and jobs. And just the process of clearing that is very well suited to large corporates, but perhaps not very well suited to smaller and younger businesses. So it's something that we have certainly struggled with.
Now, as the sector grows, of course, so does opportunity. Let's go further north and look at other countries on this continent where also there's been exponential growth, but still a minority part of the real world in which people live in Kenya, for example, and in Nigeria. You bought Price Check in Nigeria from Naspers. Is there much of a startup tech culture in Nigeria that you could invest in?
We also more recently bought, together with reinvigorating, a Swiss company, we bought Deal Day, which was one of Nigeria's top e-commerce stores. That deal went through just a few weeks ago, and so I've just returned from Lagos. And Lagos in particular is seeing a huge amount of activity, both on a small scale but also on a large scale. A lot of global money going into companies like Jumia and Konga in the e-commerce space. I think there is at the moment a bit of a shakeout where some of the early stage investments were a little bit too aggressive and were a little bit too willing to accept continuous losses and massive losses. Our approach has been to focus much more on businesses that are growing but are also making money and have the potential to become profitable in the short rather than the long term. So I think this year we'll see a bit of a shakeout especially in Nigeria and to an extent the rest of the continent. But I mean, the long-term trends are obviously there. In a market with growing a number of consumers, people want to get hold of products, and that's going to, in the long term, feed this industry.
If we leapfrog across the continent, we head east into that East Africa bloc. Anecdotally, there's a lot of activity.
Absolutely, and I think Nairobi, especially a few years ago, was really fated as the next Silicon Savannah, I think was the term that a lot of people used. I think what we have certainly experienced is that many of those startups struggle to build a bridge from a tech demo to a real business driven by sales and marketing and finance and operations. And that is one of the jumps in approach that we really try and focus on in the businesses that we invest in. At the end of the day, we really see our role as investing in businesses which are 80% old-fashioned and 20% happens to be online. But that 80% is at least as important as having a good website. And I think not all early-stage startups and not all the hype that we hear has necessarily understood that distinction.
And so much of this, of course, cannot happen without decent connectivity. It can't happen without great cell phone providers. It can't happen without mobile devices, because that is certainly the future. The idea that the internet and internet businesses and tech businesses will be built on a desktop computer is long gone.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we see increasingly, obviously, that mobile is very important for our businesses. I think desktop is still very important, and we shouldn't overestimate that trend. But absolutely connectivity vital. And this has really been the long-term driving force. It's now possible for me to sit in an office in Cape Town or Johannesburg and have real-time conversations with teams spread across Kenya, Nigeria, as well as South Africa. And those conversations, 9 times out of 10, are doable. And so that speaks to the improvement in internet connectivity. Next step, of course, is for prices to continue to fall.
Thanks to Paul Cook. Thank you very much for joining us, Paul, in our Cape Town studio, the founder and managing director of Silvertree Internet Holdings, also of Silvertree Capital. Lots of really interesting stuff happening in the world of tech investment. However, it is but a blip in the sea of global and, of course, domestic and pan-African market uncertainty. But it is interesting and exciting to see the level of investment, if only there were more people like Paul Cook making those investments. More money makers next time as we take risk takers who are prepared to take up the oar and paddle the economy forward. No, it would be a paddle to paddle the economy forward. You need an oar to go backwards, don't you? We need paddles. We need to go forward. Till next time, thank you so much for watching. Good night.